So good morning, everyone. Today we begin a brand new Chumash, and that's always exciting, as it is to close the Chumash. But to open one is certainly very exciting because it's new vistas. And as we are wont to say in this class, that we repeat very often, that the rabbis of Chabad would say that a Jew has to live with the times. And as the Rebbe would wryly note, not the New York Times, but the times that we read the Torah portion. And there's always something for us to lean into. When we read the Torah portion, there'll be a specific teaching or theme that inevitably will help shed light either on a personal situation or a communal situation. And so we are now in the book of Shemot. We open up the book of Shemot. The book of Shemot literally means, of course, names, because the Torah portion begins with Ve'ele Shemot. These are the names, and it lists all the names of the Jews, the children of Jacob that came down to Egypt, and it tells us the story of the Exodus. This is the beginning of the story of the Exodus. Last week, when we concluded the book of Bereshit, we closed with the story of Joseph and his brothers. And the last words of the book of Bereshit tell us that Joseph dies, and he promises, or he asks his brothers to promise him that they will not leave his bones in Egypt. Clearly, he could not have what his father had, which was a funeral in the land of Israel, because of his status. And in fact, the Torah tells us that Joseph was embalmed. This is recorded in the Torah. He was embalmed, as was the practice of Egypt. He was embalmed and he was buried in I guess, some type of cave, not buried in the earth. And Joseph asks the children of his brothers before he dies to please remember him. And he says there will be a time that God will remember you. And the language that he uses is Paked Yifket Hashem Eschem. God will certainly remember you or appoint you. And he says, when that happens, please take my bones out of Egypt and ensure that you take it with you into the desert and bury me in the land of Israel. And our tradition has it that Joseph is indeed buried in the land of Israel, in the city of Shechem, which the Arabs call Nablus. And although we have a tradition that, Shechem actually is an ancient city name, it actually predates the Jewish conquest of Canaan, as we recall that Dinah was raped by Shechem. Shechem was the name of a village, and the village was named after the owner of the village, which was Shechem. And so our sages tell us that Shechem is never going to be an easy place for the Jewish people. And until today, it's a complicated place for the Jewish people. Just a side note, the name Nablus, and I digress because it's not part of the Torah portion, but I think it's important to mention, because whenever we have an opportunity to dispel myths about the lack of Jewish connection to the land of Israel, it's important to remember that Nablus is a bastardization, for all intents and purposes, or mispronunciation of the word Naples, that the Romans renamed Shechem Naples, and the locals could not pronounce Naples very well, so they called it Naples, and that turned into Nablus. But Shechem is Nablus is Naples, and so if anything, the word Nablus does not show anything but the story of the Roman conquest of Judea and Samaria and all of Israel. So we begin this Torah portion, and we begin with the recitation of all the names of Jacob's children, hence the names. And as we are wont to do, when we talk about the name of a Torah portion, we know that although the name is usually chosen by the fact that it's usually mentioned in the first few lines of the parsha, there's always a symbolism attached to it for us. And our sages tell us, and indeed Rashi tells us, that the reason why the story of the Exodus begins with telling us the names of the Jewish people is because that one of the hallmarks that the Jewish people observed, or one of the things that has distinguished the Jewish people while they were in Egypt, was that they did not change their names. While when in a foreign culture, it is inevitable that we will have a relationship and we will start actually molding ourselves after the society within which we live, regardless of where we come from, regardless of our history. After a generation or two or three, certainly three, there's going to be a distinct impression that the society is going to make on any Jewish population in exile or anywhere else. That's the reality. And we see this all the time. I see this personally in my own family, where people in the family have moved to different places, raised in Montreal, and you see in the children and the grandchildren, depending where they live, they develop, even as very observant Torah Jews, they develop a certain cultural influence. So, for example, just in a mild way, like if you look at Jews that are like a couple generations Brooklynites, there's a certain swagger that they have. They have a certain there's a certain urban New York, um, I don't even know how to call it. There's a certain imprint that is very distinct. It's very distinct, and that's true also for us, like the for us who raise our children in Canada. There's going to be a difference also in like a Canadian Jewish kid and a Brooklyn Jewish kid or a Montreal Jewish kid, because there's a certain culture that we inevitably get influenced by. So our sages tell us that that is a reality of human nature. But what the Jews did in an exceptional way was they didn't change their names. They kept their names. And once you keep your name, you inevitably create a barrier between yourself and others. In fact, like we know that in Ellis Island, one of the great, one of the great costs of immigration was that many Jews discarded their Jewish names because they just wanted to fit in. No one wants to stand out like a sore thumb in a society that they live in. Yet the Jews kept their names. It also says that they kept their clothing. And Rashi infers, and this is something that's spoken about at great length by the sages, that it's almost the fact that they maintain their names and their distinct identity, that they were actually able to extricate themselves from galut of Mitzrayim, the Egyptian exile, and leave. Because if you live in a society and you just become part of the servant class, or you become part of the slave class, and that's what you're born into, and that's what you die into, you could go on that for millennia, because you accept that this is where you are. There's a king, there's a noble class, and you are in the slave class. But the Jewish people knew they were not slaves. The Jewish people knew that they were part of a great ancient culture. And they also knew they were part of a tradition that was started by Abraham and Isaac, and that was followed by Jacob, and that they themselves had ascribed to. And by maintaining their Jewish names, they maintained their identity. And as a result, it gave them the power to have the capacity to even think about leaving, rebelling, and following Moses into the desert, which on the surface of it didn't really make sense, because they went into a dangerous place from a secure place. Granted, no one wants to be a slave, but when they were in Egypt, they knew what their day was going to be like. Going into the desert, they didn't even know if they were going to survive. And so it was their ability to hold on to their names. And so whenever we learn this Torah portion, we have to remember that we have to like lean into our Jewish names, because our Jewish names is very much identified with our Jewish identity. That nobody changed their names at Ellis Island only after. There's a lot of debate about that, like whether people did or didn't. I've heard that too, that it was a big myth that people changed their names at Ellis Island. I think probably a mix of everything happened. Um, there are stories both ways, that they couldn't pronounce the name, and so on and so forth. Who knows? But that happens, and you see this, by the way, with Jews in every society. Even Israeli Jews change their name to Israeli names. Like this is part and parcel of the way people fit in. They want to fit into the society that they live in, and it's definitely asking for something when you hold on to your name. I remember clearly And then when we'll go into the Torah portion, when my son was born, and I named him Chaim Yehuda. At the bris, his name is Chaim Yehuda, and I don't think you can get a more Jewish name than Chaim and Yehuda. It's like it is the Jewishness of the Jewiest of Jewish names, Chaim and Yehuda. And I remember when I did for all my children when I filled out their paperwork for the registration of their birth. I grew up in a time, and I don't think it's the same time now, but I grew up in a time there was a certain sense of protection and freedom and the ability to feel that no matter what my name is, the government will respect it and embrace my my peoplehood, and it's okay to put a Jewish name. And whereas in Europe or in other places, Jews had to have a name for the Torah and then a name that they used in civil society, I felt I had the privilege when I was raising my children, as my mother did, my parents did for us, was to put our Jewish names on our birth certificate. And I did so for all my children. When it came to my son, Chaim Yehuda, things had to start to change a bit in the environment in Montreal. And I remember thinking to myself, when I put his name on the birth certificate, Chaim Yehuda, I was thinking to myself, am I doing this child a favor by putting such a Jewy name on his birth certificate? But I did it anyway, and he has a beautiful Jewish name, and he's very proud of it. But that is certainly a blessing to be able to do that. And it's certainly a tool, because if that is, forget about what your name is in synagogue. If that's your name on your papers, it really does solidify your Jewish identity. So our sages do talk about the importance of leaning into our Jewish names at this time. Now, in a nutshell, when we open up the book of Shemot, which I'm going to share with you very shortly, we have the story of the Jews coming back down to Egypt. The Torah tells us that Moses, that after Joseph dies, Vayakam melech chadash asher lo yadas Yosef, a new king arose that doesn't know Joseph. And Rashi brings two interpretations to that. Rashi says, one says that it was a new king who really didn't know Joseph. And the other interpretation that Rashi brings is actually, no, it was the same king who pretended he didn't know Joseph. And which one is the truth? Rashi brings both, and probably there's an element of truth to both. When Rashi brings two interpretations, it means that he's not wholly satisfied with either. So that there is an element of Joseph dying, and yes, maybe there was a new king, but it was beyond the fact that there was a new king. There was a shift, which is Joseph did his duties, he's no longer in power, and his people no longer have protection. So we have the story, and we're told that the Jewish people are starting to be enslaved. And the Egyptians see the Jewish people as a fifth column, as a threat, that the Jewish people are multiplying in an exceedingly fast fashion, and that the Pharaoh calls in the Jewish midwives and says, you have to start taking all the male-born boys, and you have to throw them in the Nile. And the midwives make all kinds of stories. They say that these Jewish women are so strange, the babies pop out of them without labor, and by the time we come, the baby's already hidden. And so we have the oppression starting to build. The killing of the firstborn, the killing of the male boys, the intensity of the labor, and then we're told that Moses is born. And Moses is born, and his mother puts him very famously on the River Nile. She makes a little boat for him, and she hopes that he'll be safe, because they were coming around looking for newborn boys. And there is a famous story of the Pharaoh's daughter goes out to bathe, and she hears a baby crying, and she has mercy on the baby, and she says, this must be a Jewish child. She takes the child to her rather. And then, of course, we know that Miriam, the sister of Moses, is standing and watching to see what will happen. And when she sees that Pharaoh's daughter takes the baby, and she's looking for a nurse, a wet nurse to nurse the baby, she offers her mother. And therefore Moses is nursed by his mother for the first 2 years of his life, but he goes back to the palace, and he knows he's Jewish. He's an adopted child of Pharaoh's daughter, and he has compassion on the Jewish people. And the Torah tells us that one day Moses saw someone abusing a Jew, and he looked right and he looked left, and he saw that there was no one there, and he killed the person who was abusing the Jew, and he had to flee Egypt. And he goes to Midian, which is an adjoining country, and he comes to Midian, and there is a very famous story with of the girls at the well, where the well is a place that the men are, there's like I guess gangs who control the well, and so therefore we have this shepherd Yitro whose daughters go out every day, and they're kind of abused, and they come home very late. They have to wait for everyone to leave, and this one day Moses comes and he helps them out, and they're able to water their animals, and they come home and tell their father the story, and the father said, who's the stranger that helped you? Bring him to our house. And the long story short, Moses marries Zipporah, the oldest daughter of Yitro, and Moses becomes a shepherd for Yitro. And then we encounter Moses, and this is going to be the focus of our discussion today. We encounter Moses as a shepherd of Yisro in the plains of Midian, and he is shepherding his father-in-law's sheep. And suddenly one of the sheep run away, and Moses runs after the sheep. And what happens? Very famously, Moses comes across a bush that is burning. It's a thorn bush, and the bush is burning, and it's not being consumed. And in this moment of this great sight that Moses sees, he has a communion with God, and this starts to herald and begin the redemption of the Jewish people. And our focus today will be that encounter that Moses has with the burning bush. But before we begin and talk about the burning bush, I just want to take a segue, and then we're going to get into the Torah portion. I want to take a segue and talk about the fact that we see a motif throughout all the great Jewish leaders, which is that the Jewish leaders first come to greatness as great shepherds. We know that Abraham was a shepherd, and what gives him great distinction is that he refuses to allow his sheep to graze in other people's fields, as opposed to his nephew Lot. We know that Jacob was a great shepherd, and of course Jacob meets Rachel at the well, also by the shepherding. And we know that King David was a great shepherd. And we find out here that Moses is a great shepherd, and that it is his shepherding that kind of throws him into the position of being a Jewish leader. And indeed, the Jewish leadership in our liturgy, in the Tehillim, in the Zohar, and in general, in our writings, the shepherd is the symbol of a Jewish leader, or the Jewish leader is the shepherd, and it's synonymous. In fact, there's it's called Roe Yisrael, the shepherd of the Jewish people. The Zohar calls it Raya Mehemna, the shepherd of our people. So the shepherd is the symbol of the Jewish leader, and this has to be noted at a time when we talk about so much leadership is in flux all over the world. We see this, well, United States and Canada. Right now, the political situation is very uncertain, and in many countries all over the world. And if we look at world religions, we look at different communities, and we see who people choose as their great leader. Often it will be a general, it will be a warrior, it will be a fighter, or it will be someone who is incredibly perfect. So, for example, in the Islamic tradition, when they have their faith, they choose as their leader the warrior. The great warrior is the leader. It's not that Moses is not a warrior, but that's not how he's defined. He's not the great warrior. And it's not that King David wasn't a warrior, but that's not how he was defined. That's not how he came to be a leader. It was through being a shepherd. And then you have in other religions where the great leader is the perfect person who creates miracles, who has like a super personality. But in the Jewish tradition, the great person, the leader of the Jewish people, is not the great warrior. It's not the perfect person, but it is the compassionate shepherd that cares for the sheep. And we find that in all our great leaders, there's a story with the shepherd and the sheep. King David, we're told, becomes the leader of the Jewish people after he lovingly takes care of his sheep. The Medrash tells us a story about King David, that King David had a problem. He saw that when the sheep went out to graze in the field, the young sheep that were not the small, not the very small, and not the elderly sheep, but the young, strong sheep would come out, run out first, and devour the best part of the grass, and they would leave the stubble for the slower sheep, the older sheep, and for the baby sheep.
Don't get married. Oh, see now, as a Jew, I didn't even. Priests cannot get married.
Let me just find out where that noise is coming from.
That'd be a real challenge. Yeah, I had
Okay.
a follow-up joke, but I'll leave you.
Okay, here we go. That's perfect. So, ladies, if you could just keep it on mute unless we're having a discussion. Okay. So, as I was saying, the Medrash tells us that King David saw this problem, and what did he do? He took the baby sheep and the strong sheep and the elderly sheep, and he divided them into pens when it came to feeding. And what he did was, when it came to feeding, he opened up the pens of the baby sheep, and he allowed the babies to come and eat the very top of the grass, which is the softest part. Then, when they were all filled, he put them back into their pen, and he put out the older sheep to pasture. And the older sheep were able to eat the middle part of the grass, which is a little bit more tough, but not so tough. And then he let out the young, strong sheep, and they finished off the field, and they were able to eat everything. And our sages tell us that the sensitivity that King David had to see that the older sheep were having a hard time getting easily digestible grasses, and the younger sheep were not being able to digest their grasses. So he devised this plan, and he built pens, and he took all this effort to make these pens for the sheep. That's the hallmark of a Jewish leader. And it has to be said that the hallmark of a Jewish leader and what creates a Jewish leader is not that he's a warrior, though he may be one. It's not that even he's a great scholar, though he may be one, or a saint, though he may be one. But primarily, he has to have compassion. He has to have love and a gentleness. And of course, sheep are the most gentle of animals. And someone who is so gentle to sheep has the capacity to be gentle to human beings. And therefore, all our great leaders, and even someone like Moses, you would think that if Moses has to be the one, if you had to make a candidate to go confront Pharaoh, to lead the Jewish people in a rebellion, you would say, like, I need a Donald Trump. What am I going to do with a nice little shepherd? I need to make a big rebellion now. I need someone tough. I need someone who's going to talk tough. And I need someone who's going to talk down Pharaoh. No. Who does God choose? God chooses someone who knows the ins and outs of the Egyptian ways, but who is above all a person who stands up for women who are being molested at a well, who stands up for injustice, and above all, who sees a sheep running away and is worried something will happen to him. And the Torah tells us that when Moses, again, part of the Medrash, that Moses caught up to his sheep, the sheep was tired. He didn't know why the sheep was running where he was running. Obviously, the sheep was running to bring him to the burning bush. And so he carried the sheep the way back. And again, this speaks a gentleness of a caring, of a love, of a compassion. And this, our sages tell us, is the hallmark of a Jewish leader. Now, so Moses comes to this burning bush, and he has a very fascinating experience. And with that, we're going to open up the Chumash. Because we're going to go into, as I mentioned in the class description, we're going to go into the enigmatic and the pragmatic elements of this encounter. So this is the beginning of Shemot, as I mentioned before. It tells us the names of the Jewish people who came down to Egypt and the lessons that are found in them. But let's get now to the burning bush. This is when Moses confronts the. Okay, here we go. So the Torah tells us the story. Moses is tending the flocks of his father-in-law, and he guides the flocks, and he comes to a place that, I'm just going to say this for a second. In this translation, and I'm going to have to consider maybe finding another translation for this reason. The translation that has been updated to Chabad.org is a translation that now interpolates the translation of the Torah verse with Rashi. You see this a bit. Like there's a bit of an explanation that kind of interpolates. It's not always very literal, but it gives us the idea. So Moses was tending to the sheep of his father-in-law, and he came across the mountain of God, and the Torah tells us an angel of God appeared to him in the heart of a blazing fire from the midst of a thorn bush. And Moshe sees something very unusual. The Torah tells us that Hasne bo'er ba'esh, the thorn bush, was burning in fire, v'hasne einenu uchal, but the thorn bush was not being consumed. And Moses is very piqued by this. And he says, Asurana, let me turn, ve'era, and let me see, esmare hagadol hazeh, this incredible sight. Madua lo yivar hasneh, why is not the bush burning down? And as we know, a dry bush in the desert usually burns down very quickly, as we see in this past week. It doesn't take much to burn bushes down. And over here, the bush is burning, but it's not being consumed. And this phenomenon is piquing the interest of Moses. And the Torah tells us, Vayar Hashem, God saw, Kisar Lirais, that Moses had turned to the bush. Vayikra Elav, so God calls Mitoch Hasneh, from amongst the thorn bush, Vayomer, and he says to him, Moshe, Moshe, Moses, Moses, Vayomer, and he answers, Hineni. And he says to him, I am here. And God says to him, Vayomer al tikrav halim, do not come any nearer. And Chal na'alecha me'al raglecha, take off the shoes from your feet. Ki hamakom asher ate omed alav, because the land on which you are standing, admas kodesh hu, it is a holy land. And then God continues and he says, Vayomer, and he says to him, Anochi Elokei avicha, I am the God of your father, Elokei Avraham, the God of Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, the God of Yitzchak, the Elokei Yaakov, and the God of Yaakov. Vayaster Moshe panav, Moses covered his face, Kiyare, because he was afraid, Mehabit El Elokim, to look at God. And then the Torah continues, Vayomer Hashem, and God says to him, Ra'ah ra'isi es ani ami, I see the affliction of my people, Asher b'Mitzrayim, who are in Egypt. Ve'ezakatzam shamati, and I have heard their cries. Mipnei naigeshav, because of their taskmasters. In other words, because of the suffering that they're enduring. Ki yadati es ma'akov, I am aware of their pains. Ve'ered, and I have come down, lahatziloi, to save them, miyad Mitzrayim, from the hand of Egypt. Ulahalaisai, and to take them up, min haaretz hahi, from that land, el haaretz taiva urchava, to a beautiful and good and wide land, el aretz zavas chalad v'dvash, to a land that is flowing with milk and honey, al makaim haknani, this is the land that currently belongs to the Canaanites, the Canaan, Hachiti, the Hittites, Amori, the Amorites, Haprizi, the Prizis, Chivis, the Chivis, and Yevusi and the Yevusi. These are all the 7 tribes of Canaan. And then God continues and he says, Va'ata, and now, Hine tzakas b'nei Yisrael ba'elai, the cry of the Jewish people has come to me. V'gam ra'isi es halachat, and I see the oppression, Asher Mitzrayim lochatzim atzam, that the Egyptians are oppressing them with. Va'ata, and now, l'cha go, ve'eshlachacha al parai, and I will send you to Pharaoh. V'haitze es ami b'nei Yisrael Mitzrayim, and take my nation out of bondage and of Egypt. So this is the beginning of the revelation. And then Moses gets into a conversation. And what's the first thing that Moses says to God after he is asked to go to save the Jewish people from Egypt? Yomer Moshe el Elokim, Moses says to God, Mi anaychi, who am I? Ki elech al pare, that I should go to Pharaoh. V'chi aitzi es b'nei Yisrael mitzrayim. I can take the Jewish people out of Egypt? That's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Who am I? I'm nobody. I'm a shepherd. Vayomer, God says, Ki imach, I will be with you. V'zel ha'ais, and you will have a sign. Ki anoichi shlachticha, I will send you. When you take over the people out of Egypt, they will worship God by this mountain. So this is the opening dialogue between Moses and God. And we're going to go now and just delve a little bit into this idea of what happens here. So before we go into the Rashi and into the commentaries on this very fascinating revelation that Moses has, it's interesting to note that Moses has a very enigmatic revelation. Why does Moses have to go into the desert? Why is it that God has to speak to him through a burning bush? Why is it that it has to be a thorn bush? Why is it that the thorn bush doesn't burn? Why does Moses have to take off his shoes? Why can't he get any closer? These are all part of the enigmatic part of the burning bush. The burning bush is a symbol that is much more than a story of when Moses got the marching orders to take the Jewish people out. Our sages see in the story of the burning bush layers and layers of truth about leadership, about human suffering, about justice. And these are the things that we're going to kind of unravel today in our class. What is the meaning behind this burning bush? And why did Moses have to experience this burning bush? And the elements of this burning bush. So let's go into the commentary, Rashi, without whom we cannot really understand the very basic meaning of the text, because Rashi gives us often the explanation from a very simple perspective. The Torah tells us that, so the Torah tells us that God appears to him in a fire, right? In a sneh. So a sneh is a thorn bush. It's a thorn bush, I guess, that is particular to the desert. It has no leaves. It's ugly, and it's full of thorns. And Rashi, obviously, who says about himself, "Ini basi ela lefar pshuta shel mikra," I have come only to explain the plain meaning of the verse. Rashi asks the question, why is it that the Torah tells us that this was a thorn bush? Why is that important in the narrative? We have a few elements here, that it's a fire, that it's a fire in a thorn bush, that the thorn bush is not being consumed, but the fire is still burning, and that Moses has to take off his shoes. So Rashi asks the question, why is it that the Torah tells us that it was a thorn bush? It could have told us that there was a blazing fire in the midst of a bush. For example, right? I'll give you an example. When it comes to the Eitz Hadas, when it comes to the tree of knowledge, that Adam and Eve were instructed not to eat from this tree of knowledge. When it comes to that, the Torah doesn't tell us precisely what the tree of knowledge was. It's called the tree of knowledge, and there's all kinds of theories. Some say it was a fig tree. Some say it was a different fruit, a date tree, a pomegranate tree. It was never an apple tree according to any definition. That came much later in illustrations. But what was it? We don't know. Now, wouldn't it be important to know that if a tree was forbidden, that we should know what type of fruit was growing on the tree? And no, we don't know. The Torah doesn't tell it to us, and we just have guesses. And the guesses are based on certain lines in the Torah. But why wouldn't we know what type of tree it was that Adam wasn't allowed to eat from? Because really, at the end of the day, it was not important to the story. It was that there was a prohibition. Adam broke the prohibition, and that was the crux of the story. And the, I guess, exploration of human nature that prohibits something and then suddenly we want it. So here, the Torah tells us that he's in the desert and a bush is burning. It would suffice to say there was a bush burning, We don't have to know the exact type of bush that it was, but the Torah mentions the word sneh several times. It's not that it tells us once it was a sneh, it was a thorn bush. The Torah tells us every time it speaks about the fire that it was a thorn bush. It repeats it over and over and over again. So our sages tell us that in this revelation that Moses experienced, there's a message within the thorn bush of the fact that God chooses, first of all, to reveal himself to Moses in a thorn bush, but more importantly, that the Torah lets us know that it was a thorn bush, so that there's a lesson for us in the thorn bush. So Rashi, of course, notices this because Rashi is proficient in all of Torah, in all of Tanakh, and he notices an anomaly. He notices when something is mentioned where it otherwise would not be mentioned. And Rashi says, why a thorn bush? What does the Torah tell us about a thorn bush? And here we're going to go into the Rashi. And from there, we're going to go into the commentators on this little aspect of the thorn bush. So the Torah tells us, Mitoch hasneh. As I mentioned, it tells us, in this pasuk alone, right, it mentions the sneh 3 times. Vayar malach Hashem elav v'labas eish mitoch hasneh. Here's 1 time, sneh, thorn bush, sneh, thorn bush, the hasneh, thorn bush. 3 times it tells us about the thorn bush. Even if it was telling us a story about a thorn bush, why does it have to mention 3 times? It could just tell us once it was a thorn bush. But when he saw that the thorn bush was on fire and the thorn bush was on fire, and 3 times, thorn bush, thorn bush, thorn bush. So when we're told 3 times about a thorn bush, that piques Rashi's interest. Because first of all, why do we have to know the type of bush it is? And beyond that, why 3 times? So Rashi says, Mitar chasneh, from amongst the thorn bush, v'lo ilan acher, and not any other tree. Meaning, the Torah tells us specifically what type of tree it is, and the Torah specifically tells us that it was a thorn bush. And it doesn't mention, and God specifically chose the thorn bush and not any other tree. Mishum. Why? Because there was a notion. Imai anaychi b'tzara. I am with him in his distress. And here we have the quotation from Tehillim, from Psalms, that it says about God, Imai anaychi b'tzara. I am in with him in distress. So the question of why is it a thorn bush starts to have more implications than we can imagine. The thorn bush reflects distress on the surface of it. This is Rashi's interpretation. Rashi brings Tehillim. The thorn bush represents distress. So God is telling Moses, I am with him in distress, meaning I recognize that the Jewish people are suffering in Egypt, and therefore there is a thorn bush. The thorn bush reflects the suffering. The thorn bush, the minute you touch it, you get cut. So the thorn bush reflects the fact that God is saying, I am with you in distress. And then we're told that Moses looks and sees that there's a phenomenon, that the bush is not burnt, the bush is not being consumed, okay? And yet it's still burning. And then that the fact is that we're told that Moses is told to remove his shoes from his feet, for the place that he's standing is holy ground. So on the surface of it, the reason why we have a thorn bush is because God is reaching out to Moses to tell him, I hear the suffering of the Jewish people. The thorn bush, being that it's prickly and painful, reflects the suffering, and therefore that is why the thorn bush is chosen. And that is the plain meaning of the verse. But a deeper meaning of the verse of why a thorn bush is chosen is found in different writings. Why a thorn bush? And the Medrash actually says something very beautiful, that when Moses saw that the tree was burning, the thorn bush was burning, meaning that the fire was burning, but somehow, although there was a fire, the thorn bush was not being eradicated, it was not being destroyed. He saw in it a certain truth about the reality of suffering. In fact, when there's an explanation that's given from the Hasidic masters, that we see that Moses, when he's asked by God to come and to speak on behalf of the Jewish people and to bring the redemption to the Jewish people, he's very reluctant. So first, as we saw, Moses says, "Who am I to do it? I'm not qualified." And then you see, and we'll see this soon, Moses goes into a dialogue with God, and he starts to explain to God that he's not capable. Then he starts telling God that Pharaoh won't listen to him. Then he says the Jewish people won't believe him. And finally Moses says to God, Lachna biyatishlach, send someone else. And the question is why? Why did Moses have such a reluctance to go and help the Jewish people? So on the surface of it, it speaks to Moses' humility. Moses was humble. The Torah tells us about Moses. V'hayish Moshe, anav mikol adam asher al pnei ha'adama. That Moses was the most humble of all people living. And so even though he had greatness in him, he didn't recognize it in himself. And God had to show him the greatness that was in him. So he's reluctant to go because he's very humble. That's the surface, the pshat explanation. The Hasidic masters and the Kabbalists see this in a much deeper framework. And the reason why they see this in a much deeper framework is because we have a notion that any type of suffering that exists in this universe, especially when it's a communal Jewish suffering, so an exilic type of suffering, a galut type of suffering, that this suffering is rooted in the Egyptian exile. In other words, that there are certain paradigms for all things good, for all things bad, for joyous. The idea of lack of agency, the idea of being in a foreign country, or even if in your own country, but foreign entities rule you. So it doesn't only mean being outside of the land of Israel. As we know today, one could be living inside the land of Israel, and yet Israel does not have full agency. So when we talk about having galut, it's not only place on the map, it's also a place in a psychological space and also a geopolitical reality. You are dealing with whatever it is, with the restrictions that have been imposed on you. So our sages tell us that the first suffering, the first communal suffering, which is Galut Mitzrayim, and then of course the Exodus, which is the redemption, becomes the hallmark, the paradigm, and the leitmotif for any other suffering that we will ever experience as a people. And all the answers in how we deal with suffering, or where is God in our suffering, or even the questions, is found in this kind of paradigm. So everything repeats itself, just in a different manifestation. All galut is really back to Egypt. Any type of suffering is found and rooted in this suffering, which is a reality of lack of agency and the lack of ability to change the reality. That's what galut is. In addition to being away from your country, but it's not enough to be in your country. We see this, unfortunately, with the state of Israel, where for 2,000 years, Jews were persecuted. And Jews thought, if we only get our own country, persecution will end. It's because we're foreigners in other people's countries, and that's what triggers them. And yet, now Jews are called colonialists for going back to their own country. So you see that the idea of galut is much deeper than a space of political reality. It's a certain energy that exists in the universe where there's a lack, a withholding of agency, freedom, peace, tranquility, no matter where you are, and that your destiny is tied up with foreign powers. That's the idea of galut. So the Hasidic masters say that when Moses said to God, "Send someone else," one of the reasons why he said that was he wasn't talking about send someone else literally. I mean, that is also true because we read the Torah through different layers. But it was more than just saying send someone else. He was essentially saying, God, if I overcome Egypt, if I take the Jewish people out of Egypt, does suffering end? Is that the end of the story of suffering? The suffering continues. And what is the metaphysical manifestation of that Moses understood? It was the fact that although there was a fire, which he saw as godly, God's passion, God's intervention, the fire wasn't able to destroy the bush. It wasn't enough to take down the suffering. The thorn bush represents suffering. That's what Rashi tells us. Rashi tells us in the plain meaning of the verse, the reason why we're told that this is a thorn bush is because a thorn bush represents suffering. A tree that is a tree that we dream about, the beautiful tree, is the lush green tree. Even better, the tree that gives delicious fruits. A tree that gives beautiful fruits and provides a beautiful shade is the epitome of blessing. A tree that is a thorn bush, that has no leaves, that does not provide shelter, does not provide any type of respite from the heat, and God forbid you should get close to it, it will cut your fingers. That tree represents suffering. So Moses is saying to God, Lachna bi'atishlach, send someone else. Not that I am not qualified, which Moses himself definitely felt he wasn't qualified, but he felt there was a futility to the exercise because he's seeing a truth manifest in front of his eyes, which is that there is the thorn cuts, the thorn causes hurt, and the thorn cannot be vanquished. Different than the fires that we see, how fire naturally works. God forbid, look what happened in California now, where the fire has devastated beyond devastation. The fire naturally consumes. Fire is a passionate consumer. And here, this fire was consuming and not destroying the tree. And so Moses says, I see a truth here. I see a metaphysical truth, which is that I could take the Jewish people out of exile, but the troubles will never end. And what's the point, God? What's the point of leaving one exile to go to another suffering, to go to another suffering, to go to another suffering? Moses, remember, had an aversion to people suffering. The first interaction that we have with Moses, once he's weaned and grows up, is that when he sees people are being hurt and they're being beaten, he can't handle it. So he goes and he kills the person who's being abusive. He goes to the well in Midian and he sees girls are being molested at the well and they're not being allowed to take water. He can't handle it. He steps in. He may have been killed. He's a stranger. He has no family to run to. No one will care that he lays there on the floor at the well. He's a stranger. No one will come after him. He can't handle it. When the little shepherd, the little sheep runs away from him, can't handle it. So Moses cannot handle the pain of the Jewish people. And you see this, by the way, if you want to see the motif that actually flows through the entire Exodus, is that when the Jewish people cry out to Moses, Moses then cries out to God. Like Moses is a great empath. He has a tremendous capacity for feeling others' pain, and he can handle it. And so he's seeing something in the truth of the burning bush, which is that he may take the Jewish people out of the galut now, but this will not end the suffering. So the Hasidic masters say that what was troubling Moses was that he was seeing a futility in a temporary deliverance, if that deliverance would not bring about a permanent peace, permanent lack of suffering. And so Moses is actually struggling with the whole notion of suffering. And that's why God tells him, don't go any closer. You can know so much, but you can't know more than that. And so Moses sees the burning bush and he's troubled by it. And he's also afraid of it because he sees a certain truth. And the truth that he sees is that suffering is not going to end. Even if he's the one to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, suffering will not end. And in fact, the end of this week's Torah portion ends with a cry of Moses, a complaint that has to be read in its original, because Moses is driven by a passion to help people who are suffering. And I'm going to just share that with you here. Let me just get to the Torah section. Here we go. The Torah tells us at the end of this week's Torah portion that when Moses goes to visit the king of Egypt, the king of Egypt decides that it's a chutzpah of Moses to come and mix in. And then what he does is he actually holds them accountable and gives them even greater restrictions. Before Moses came, they received straw to make the bricks. Now they have to gather their own straw and still make the quota that they're entitled to make. So after Moses meets Pharaoh, he says, you must no longer provide the people with straw for making bricks as you did previously. Let them go and gather their own straw. However, you must impose upon them the same quota of bricks as they had previously. Do not reduce it, for they are lazy. And this is why they are crying out and saying, let us go and sacrifice to our God. So when Moses finally does come back to Pharaoh, the first attempt actually hurts the Jewish people even more than before. In other words, Moses didn't help things, it got things worse. And Pharaoh says, make them work harder and keep at it, and no more, and enough with this nonsense of trying to say that you have to leave or whatever it is. And then we're told that the Jewish people have to go and they have to gather more straw, and they start beating them, and they're beating them for not meeting the quota. Sorry. And at the end of the saga of this back and forth, that they're being called lazy and they have to work harder and harder. The Torah tells us that people came to Moses and they complained, and these words, and then Moses in turn goes to God, and this is how the Torah portion ends off. Vayeshev Moshe el Hashem vayemer, and Moses returned to God and he said, Adonai, God, lama harayesa la'am hazeh, why have you made it worse for the people? Lama zeh shlachtani, why have you sent me? In other words, he sees a futility in the mission. Ume'az basi el param, and since I have come to Pharaoh to confront Pharaoh, ledaber b'shmecha, to speak in your name, heira lahamazeh, you have made it worse for these people. V'hatzel lahitzalti es hamecha, and you have not delivered to your people. And then God tells Moses, don't worry, you're going to see good things will happen. And that's how the Torah portion ends up. But we meet Abraham with all kinds of struggles. We meet Isaac with all kinds of struggles. We meet Jacob with all kinds of struggles. We meet Joseph with all kinds of struggles. But we never have the language in the Torah that we have now, which is Moses' plaintive cry. Lama harayesha la'amazeh, why have you made it worse for your people? Why is Moses crying this way? Because Moses does not see the point of a redemption that does not include an end to all suffering. The cry of Moses is an internal cry of why is there suffering, and the Moses is told to take off his shoes at the burning bush, which is part of a greater idea. And I want to share with you this one idea, and before we have to close. The Torah tells us that Moses was told by God, take off your shoes. You're coming to a holy place. And the question is, why? Why do I have to take off my shoes when I come to this holy place? And the Talmud tells us, if I think I could find it here. Oh, it's not the Talmud, actually. It's in the Medrash. The Medrash tells us, let me see if I can find it and share it with you. The Medrash tells us here that there are a few times when a person is told to remove their shoes. The removal of the shoes is in a few places. One is here when Moses is told to take off his shoes. The second time we have this is that God tells Joshua to remove his shoes. And the third time is that the priests in the temple only served barefoot. And so the question is, what is the idea of these three reasons for taking off your shoes? We don't see it everywhere that we take off our shoes. For example, when we go to a synagogue, we don't take off our shoes. But it's true that when the priests served in the temple, they took off their shoes. Moses was told to take off his shoes, and Joshua was told to take off his shoes. What's the idea of taking off the shoes? So shoes actually are a blocking, or they are a separation between our foot and the ground. And the ground represents all that which is not holy. So the Rebbe says that Moses did not want to be impacted by he did not want to be impacted by the ground. He didn't want to be drawn into that ground because he felt it, he didn't want to touch it. And God said to him, no, touch it, it's holy. In other words, that there's a purpose to this, to the suffering. There's a purpose to this, to all of this. And I just want to conclude with another interpretation that I saw that's very, very touching about this idea of the burning bush. A teaching that comes to us from the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad, and here comes the Pragmatic. The Alter Rebbe says that what bothered Moses in the burning bush was he saw a certain futility. As I mentioned, the Kabbalists talk about this futility in terms of a single redemption that will not herald the ultimate redemption. And that when Moses said, Lachna bi'atishlach, he meant to God, send the ultimate redeemer. In other words, ends all suffering. And 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 then we have the idea that there's this unfinished business in a thorn bush that burns but is not consumed. And the Alter Rebbe says, what was troubling Moses? What was troubling Moses was the futility of the energy. There was so much energy in that bush. The fire represents energy, and yet the bush, which is the thorn bush, which is the negativity, is not burned. And Moses was drawn to it, but he was also puzzled by it and almost repelled by it. And the Alter Rebbe says that this burning bush, the bush that burns but is not consumed, reflects actually all of human nature, all of human trouble, and even the thorn bush that is the negative aspects of our personality. So we are all two sides of a coin. We have a good side and we have the negative side, our ugly side and our nice side, our weak side and our strong side. We all are, unless we're tzaddikim, we all are this fallible human person. And that is true for us personally, and that's also true for society, and that's true for all of reality. The reality of this universe is that there's two aspects that we have to deal with. And one of them is the fact that in every one of our lives, whether it is inside of ourselves or it's within the purview of our human experiences, so things that we've experienced, or whether it's part of our communal experiences or even our societal experiences, that there is going to be a thorn bush somewhere that will not be completely destroyed. As much as we want that thorn to gotten rid of, there's always going to be that thorn in our side. And the thorn in our side, says the Alter Rebbe, is not necessarily a thorn that, it could be a thorn that presents itself, as I said, in our own personality, that we are that thorn, that it is us who is the thorn. And then we can come to points in our lives that we can ask ourselves, how is it that after everything that I've done to evolve and to be a better person, this is still a struggle for me? How is this that with all the passion that I put into my life, or the energy, because that's what the fire represents, I have been unable to burn away my thorns. I have been unable to burn away that negative aspect of my personality. And we could take it in a more cosmic level. Why is there suffering? Why are things in our families that are not perfect? Why are there things in society that are not perfect? Why is it that we always have like close but no cigar in so many situations, whether it's in the land of Israel, whether it's within our Jewish leadership, whether it's in our societies? whatever it is, we're like almost there, but no cigar. We cannot yet, we're just not able to overcome completely. And above all, the most painful place for us to experience this is within ourselves. That we see that there are parts of us that we identify is prickly. It's prickly because it's not our strong suit. So lack of courage or too much or not enough forethought, whatever it is, however it shows up in our beings, we all have to work with our thorn bush. And as I said, that thorn bush could be a personal thorn bush, it could be more of a cosmic idea of the imperfection that is found in this world. And Moses was very troubled by that. Why doesn't the fire burn it? The nature of fire is that it should overcome it. It just doesn't burn it. It's always there. And the Alter Rebbe says that what Moses was experiencing, or what was being shown to him, was that there is a purpose in the struggle, and there's a purpose even in small victories, even if the struggle will never end. And that the most human part of humanity, of being a human being, is that we do struggle. And that rather than becoming despondent from the struggle, to see the struggle as just part and parcel of the way God created the universe. It doesn't mean that we stop burning. We keep burning. We keep burning at it. We keep giving the passion and the love and the fire or the hope. That keeps going. But if we see that the thorn bush is not being consumed, we should not become despondent because God set it up in such a way that most people will have to experience a thorn bush their entire life. And as I said, that thorn bush is not only things that happen outside of ourselves, out of our control, which is definitely true for ourselves as well, but it could be in the very making of our personhood, in our very personality, that there are thorns that we can become so despondent. How is it that after X amount of years, I still struggle with this, and I've spent so much time overcoming this element of my personality, which is negative, and it still poses a threat to me. It's still a thorn. It still cuts. Maybe I'm cutting someone else. Maybe I'm hurting. Maybe my thorn is hurting someone else, or maybe it's hurting me. So the Alter Rebbe says that what Moses saw was a futility in the exercise, and God says, "No, don't don't come closer to this. Don't try to analyze this. There is a purpose to it, and there is a greatness even in the struggle itself, and that is really part of the human condition." And what Moses, in his great empathy, wanted to see was certain elements just solved for all time. And that's why he said, "Shlach na b'yad tishlach." He's almost insinuating, just don't send me, send the ultimate redemption. Because what's the point? And the Alter Rebbe says, no, there is a point. Because there is an overcoming. And that in God's eyes, the battle is always there. And as I saw it so eloquently stated, that God is telling, again from the teachings of the Rebbe that I saw transcribed by Rabbi Tauber, Yankee Tauber. He says that God is essentially telling Moses, "I am in the groan of a beaten slave. I am in the pain of someone who is wounded. I am there. Fire of God is with the thorn, and that fire will never leave. And even if it's true that the way this world has been created is such that the thorn will always be there, don't become despondent and don't despair. Keep keep the fire, because there is a value even in the struggle of itself. And that's something that is true on a personal level, whether it's something that we have to self-correct, or whether it's when we see things in our world, in our society, that really are so painful. Whether that is something that's happening to the Jewish people, or even what's happening in the world. For example, the fires in California, which I find so hard to wrap up my brain around. There seems to be such a futility in that kind of destruction. And you're like, Lama Hare Isa, God, why did you allow this to happen? So much suffering for no reason, seemingly out of the blue. These are the questions that we can ask ourselves when we look around the world. And God is telling us that Moses had those same questions. And the manifestation of the burning bush was to teach us a lesson, not only for Moses' time, but for all time. That not to discount that God is there with us, even in the burning bush. And that our fire always has to be applied to our thorn bush. So the thorn bush could be from within or could be from without, but that there is an exercise and that there ultimately will be a redemption. And even if we are not privy to the redemption, we should never give up hope. Just like the bush would not stop burning, even though it was not consuming the thorn bush. The fire didn't stop burning. It didn't give up. It didn't dry out. It's tried. And there's a value in the struggle of itself that we should not discount. And the Alter Rebbe says we should not become despondent by struggle. We should not become despondent by adversity. We should understand that that is the makeup of the nature of the human being, or for that matter, the world. But even there, in the thorn bush, in the pain, God is with every pain, and there is a greater plan for that pain. So we work through the pain, we overcome the pain, and we know redemption eventually does follow. And not to become depressed or despondent, and certainly not to be too hard on ourselves when we feel that our thorns are still quite cutting, and we haven't yet mastered the art of becoming softer or kinder, or having less of a temper, or being less judgy, or whatever it is that we struggle with as human beings. The list is endless, depending on our situation, our experiences in life, our personalities, the way we were raised, the way we were born. We will each inevitably have our own package to deal with, but that there is a value in the passion, and that there's a value in the struggle. And that's one of the great teachings of the book of Tanya that the Alter Rebbe wrote, which is that don't be afraid of the struggle. That even if you feel that you're not winning, right now you didn't win, but the next minute you could win. And the next minute you could win. And every single day you start again. And that's what God was telling Moses. It's true that there may be other pains that follow this pain, but there is a purpose in the Jewish people leaving Egypt. At least for the very reason that we could get the Torah, and at least for the very reason that we create a hallmark and we create a bastion and we create a paradigm for what redemption looks like, so that when it does happen, we will be able to recognize it and listen to it and see it, and not be so lost because we never had that experience. So those small experiences of redemption, whether that's a personal redemption that we feel in our psyche, or whether that we experience as a nation or a society experiences, has value, because that redemption actually opens us up to a greater redemption, which is the ability to at least recognize the greater redemption, and certainly to lean into it and to make it happen ultimately. And that was the query that Moses had. There's so much more layers to this fascinating story of the burning bush, but this is one aspect that I leaned into this week, because I feel like the world just needs it. It's such a confusing time for the Jewish people, and it's a confusing time for society. And when we think that we have all the problems kind of solved, you have crazy stories happening, and you're like, what is happening to this world? And think about it, in the history of the world, these challenges that we're experiencing now never took place. So may this, as we lean into the story of the Exodus, we are actually leaning into the story of our own redemption. And whether that is a personal redemption or a societal redemption, we have to listen to the little voices and the cues. And the burning bush is a very big cue, not to be overwhelmed by the struggle, and to remember that even in the burning bush and even in the thorns, God is there with us personally and collectively. And that a little bit of redemption has value. And that little bit of redemption actually creates the paradigm for the ultimate redemption. And that's a beautiful teaching that I found in this week's Torah portion on the burning bush. And I wanted to share that with you. So yes, we should hear good news. We should hear good news from our brothers and sisters in the land of Israel. We should hear good news for California. God should help that those fires should finally be extinguished. It boggles my mind. I have my first cousin's daughter actually her house was completely burned to the ground. She lived in Pacific Palisades, Chabad house. The Chabad house was okay, but a young couple with 3 children, they had a condo. And thank God they're safe, and that's all they care about. But their apartment was burned to the ground, and they didn't have time to take anything with them, because it happened so quickly that, like, all their mementos, their wedding albums, all the kids' pictures, and everything is gone. And their the first reaction was just gratitude that they're alive, and then there's a certain sadness that inevitably comes in with the the loss, and then the fact that there was so much loss. And I think also for the fact that that it could happen in today's day and age where we think we're so sophisticated and we have such great technology and we have phones that buzz if someone gets kidnapped, and we have AI and we have so much brilliant technology, and yet we can't stop a fire, and the ocean is right there, that the ocean is filled with water, and this big mammoth body of water can somehow dispel the fire that is right next door to it. So I think it speaks to a certain, I think there's a certain shock that it could happen in California. You know, people are like amazed that it happened in the homes of celebrities. These, because we feel certain people are protected, certain people are blessed, certain people have the wind at their back. They do find it, they're protected, they have everything that they need. You know, I actually was in that area last year. A girl from our Chabad house got married in California, and we went to California, and the wedding was right next to Pacific Palisades. To get there, we had to drive through Pacific Palisades, and it's so beautiful. I remember driving and like, wow, imagine waking up every day to this view. It is so beautiful. It's probably one of the most beautiful places on earth. And people there were had all the resources that you should think that people of that caliber should be able to protect themselves from a fire, but not just one fire, but to devastate a whole area. And then we realize that we're not in charge, that as brilliant as we are and as technologically advanced as we are, the wind could do such damage. It's almost biblical in proportion. And when we say biblical, it's because we understand there's a helplessness or there's a grandeur to the devastation that we can't put words to. And it's a reminder that that we're not in control of everything, and that even people who have it all made in the shade could have such thorns in their life to deal with such devastation. And I could just imagine, the after effect. Yet all of this, what's happening now in Israel with the hostages, what's happening in, of course, in the constant loss of life in Israel, in the attacks that happened in the United States of late, that we look at these stories and we say, how come the goodness of this world is not consuming the thorns? And this is the question that Moses asked. And also, what is the point of even a small victory if we're not going to get the victory? So truthfully, we do have to ask for the victory. We have to pray for it every day. We do. We pray for the coming of Mashiach. Essentially, when we pray for the coming of Mashiach, is we're praying for goodness and blessing and open and revealed good, and thorn bushes that don't prick anymore. But also on a personal level, our struggles that we have, and we could think, well, we're sophisticated, and I've, for someone who had to work through something, and I've worked through it. How come this is still bothering me? How come this is still a thorn? How come there's an element of my personality that I cannot overcome? And you could get depressed. And the Alter Rebbe says, don't get depressed. Moshe, God told Moses, don't. This is holy. God is with you. God is there in the burning of the bush. And as the Rebbe says, he's in the cry. God is found in the cry of a beaten slave. He's found in the groan. He's found in the sigh, and this is what keeps us from falling apart. And it also gives us a paradigm to see redemption, whether it's a personal redemption or a greater redemption. And that's in the secret of the burning bush, because God certainly could have just given Moses any kind of instructions. He didn't have to make a show and tell. He didn't have to take him to the desert and show him a burning bush. This was clearly part of a much greater message that all of us, when we study this Torah portion, will look at that and say, what does this teach me in my life? And the lesson is not to become despondent, and to remember that there is a value. There's a value in the fight. That even though it's not a perfect outcome, there's a value in redemption, even though it's not a perfect redemption. Of course, we still don't stop fighting, we don't give up, and we continue on. And that's the message that the Alter Rebbe teaches us, is found in the burning bush. So I wish everyone a blessed week with no thorns, and may the fires only be good fires, a fire of passion, a fire of love, a fire of giving, the fire of excitement for good, and not, God forbid, destructive fires, but fires of redemption. So I wish everyone a blessed week. We should have good news for the Jewish people, and we should all have good news in our own lives, and we should have strength to deal with the thorns in our lives and not to give up. Not to give up.
Thank you.
Not only
Thank
that,
you.
the alt. I was going to add one more thing that someone asked about people suffering from depression. If they can hear this, I'll end with one more thing. Is that the Alter Rebbe says that sometimes when people feel, how come I'm still struggling with this, and they're upset about it, they should know that that question of itself is coming from a negative place. Because when we're able to accept that I'm still struggling with it, then we get up again. You know, it says that Jeva yipol tzadik v'yakum, that a righteous person will fall many times, but the ability to get back up is where the strength lies. So not to be afraid of the struggle. The struggle has value because it's the effort, it's the fire, and not to get despondent from it. And the despondency itself from not winning the struggle is actually a weakening that comes from our negative side. So we should never listen to that voice. If we say, how come I'm still struggling with this? We shouldn't say that. We'll say, look, I'm still struggling with this, and I start again. So I wish everyone a blessed week.
Thank you.
Shavua tov, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you,
to-
Devorah. Where can we find the recordings, please, for your classes?
Okay, I will put it on. I will put it on YouTube. I sometimes I'm good about it, and sometimes I'm not.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'll when someone tells that to me, it pushes me to do it. So I'll put it on YouTube. Chabad Westmount has a YouTube channel, and then there's Torah classes for ladies that I kind of put it on that. But if you want, you can email me and I'll give you a direct link once I put it on. So it'll take me about an hour to put up, but I'll put it on YouTube.
I don't have your email. Where would I find that?
Devorah. Oh, my email address, Devorah, DEVORAH,
Yeah.
easy, at ChabadWestmount.com.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Okay,
Perfect.
wish everyone a
Thank you.
blessed week. Take care.
Amen. You as well. Thank you.